Everyone, good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Rigo Villa, Community Manager on the Cisco Learning Network, and I'll be your host for this webinar. In today's session, we will be covering ISE and AWS with our speaker and presenter, Hasuk Wan. But before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, I do want to let our attendees know that all of our presenters are currently working from home, so if we do run into any technical issues during the live webinar, we'll do our very best to resolve it as soon as possible. So we just want to thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Next, if you have any questions during the session, we ask that you please post them in the question and answer panel, as that would help our panelists keep track of all of the questions and would also allow them to provide you with a much more timely response. Also, if you experience any audio streaming issues during the live presentation, I do recommend using the call-in telephone number that I'm going to post in the chat window here in just a moment. And at the end of this webinar, you're going to get a pop-up survey with a couple of questions about today's presentation, and we would really appreciate it if you can just take a moment to fill it out and share with us any thoughts or feedback that you may have about today's webinar. I also want to let our attendees know that this session will be recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing within about 5 business days after today, and I'll be sure to post some more information about that in the chat window a little bit later on. And last but not least, we are also going to be launching a couple of poll questions throughout this presentation. And when we are ready to launch one of these polls, we're going to announce it live, and then you're going to see it pop up on your webinar event screen. And then that's when you'll have an opportunity to submit your answers. So we look forward to your participation. And with all that said, I am now going to hand it over to our presenter to get us started. So Hasuk, if you're ready, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Rigo. So let's start the session with a poll question. So please help us gauge the size of your deployments. So for those of you who are partners or Cisco employees supporting the customer, just give us an average number that you can think of. Now, this may have been a mistake to have a gap in numbers here for the engineering presentation, and I'll take the fault for that. But yes, for the B answer, it's between the 10,000 and 24,999. And same for the C, it's 25,000 all the way to 49,999 and so forth. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a few seconds. And to make this more fun, let me take a guess on which of these answers will get the most votes. And in this question, I'll pick the B, between 10,000 and 24,999. Okay. So welcome. I'm Hosok Won, Technical Marketing Engineer for the Policy and Access team within the Enterprise Networking and Cloud. I'll be guiding you through the introduction of ISE deployments in the AWS. This is an interesting time for sure. In case you're wondering, ISE 3.1 that I'm talking about today has not shipped yet. We're planning to release it around end of July, so just wanted to make sure that you understand some of the many information I'm sharing today may change. However, the fact that we are releasing the feature to install ISE as AWS, the EC2 instance directly will happen for sure. Now, before we talk about the feature of the day, let me introduce you to other exciting features coming in the ISE 3.1 release. So aside from the ISE in AWS, there are tons of APIs we're introducing. This includes API for operations, such as upgrades, repository management, certificate management, but also the policies. Yes, you heard that right. You'll be able to manage ISE policies through the API. This applies to both Radius for the network access for the end users and TACAX Plus for the device administration policies. If you want to hear more about this exciting new feature, please tune in to our next webinar in July by my colleague Thomas Howard, who is one of the best speakers out there. That is not all. We have many exciting features beyond these two. We're introducing ability to do posture on Linux clients, which will support Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu Linux. We're also introducing something called custom remediation script. What it means is that you can push down a custom script as part of remediation for posture assessment on your Linux, Windows, and Mac OS. So previously, when you're doing remediation, meaning that you have an endpoint that connects and it does not meet the requirements, you had a certain set of things that you can do on the endpoint, such as install a software, update the antivirus, or install a
Sorry, Hosuke, I think we lost your audio there. Might be on mute.
Okay, yeah, I don't know how I got muted again. Well, thank you. Red Hat, we I don't know where I missed, but with the Linux posture, we support Red Hat, Ubuntu, and SUSE Linux, and we have something called the custom remediation script. So what that means is that as part of the remediation, you can run any script that you want on Windows, Linux, and OS X. So when you're going through remediation, so an endpoint connects and it does not meet the posture requirements, and that means that you could take some actions against the endpoint, such as make it update the antivirus, install in hotfix, install some software so that it can remediate it. Now with the custom remediation script, you can craft a script that runs locally on the computer. For the Windows, it's going to be a PowerShell script, and for Linux and OS X, it will be the shell script. And you can run it as the user that's been logged in, or the admin user that installed the any kind of client for that machine. Other exciting feature is the device unique ID. So as you have known, there are newer mobile OSs such as Android 10, 11, and the iOS 14, and also Windows 10 to some extent, that now randomizes its MAC address when it's connecting to a wireless network. Now, it's good for privacy. However, at the same time, for the enterprise to provide a good service for your employees, it may be kind of problematic. So we have introduced something called device unique ID, so you can track the endpoints for devices that you own. And it's integrated with the MDM as well as the BYD flow within ISE. Other exciting feature includes the admin single sign-on. So previously, when you log into the ISE admin GUI, you can only log in using the local accounts, AD accounts, and Radius accounts. However, with the new enhancement, that means that you can use SAML single sign-on to log into the admin GUI using Azure IDP or even Okta. We're also enhancing the upgrade. So the time to upgrade has been reduced to like 3 folds, or 1/3 of the time it used to be. We're also introducing some enhanced logging so you can see what's going on in terms of the changes that's been made to the system. And lastly is the zero-touch provisioning. So that means that you can bring up ISE nodes, whether it's a SNS appliance or VMware, and of course the AWS instances, by not even having involved as an admin user. Now combine the zero-touch provisioning with the API for management. That means that you can bring up any number of ISE nodes up and running, and you can even create the policies for your deployment. And for the rest of the features, I'll be presenting in the August webinar to introduce you to all the features with the 3.1. So focusing back to the ISE and the cloud, here's what we have done and what we plan to do in regards to getting ISE into the public cloud. With the 3.0 release, which was out last year, we provide the ability to deploy ISE on top of VMware Cloud. This is possible on both AWS and Azure Cloud. And with today's announcement, we are going to ship ISE 3.1, where you can install it directly on AWS as EC2 instance. And later this year, we plan to expand support for Azure Cloud and other public cloud vendors such as Oracle Cloud and Google Cloud. Now, for the AWS, it shows Q3 calendar year 21, but we're actually targeting for the end of July for the 3.1 release. Okay, so the agenda for the rest of the hour, we're going to go through the basics around AWS and ISE. So it could be mostly like a refresher for those of you who's familiar with ISE. But I wanted to make sure that we know the basics on both sides as we go into the details around the ISE in AWS setup. I have two quick demos, and then I have some caveats that I'll talk about when you're deploying ISE in the cloud. Okay, so I have another poll question, but Rigo, do you have results from the previous poll question about the sizing?
Yes, absolutely. So before we launch our second poll here, so I'll share the results of the first question. And as a reminder, the question was, what is the maximum number of active endpoints on your ISE implementation? And I do see, based on these results, that most of our participants are using less than 10,000, and that was the option with the most votes. Then we have those who are using between 10,000 to 24,000, and then followed by those who are using 100,000 to 500,000.
Okay, thank you very much. So I was incorrect. So on this question, which public cloud do you plan to use ISE with? And my guess on this one will be AWS, and hope you are correct because AWS is the first one we're introducing. Okay, I'll give you a few seconds. All right, so now let's talk about the AWS Basics. So AWS has a concept called region. So region, there are about 20 some odd regions within the globe. And within a region, there's something called a availability zone. So region, there in the West Coast, there are two regions, one in Oregon and one in California. And their availability zones are like data centers within a region that are separated apart to provide redundancy and high availability in case there's a power outage nearby or there's a natural disaster nearby. So they're separated out around like 20 to 50 miles between the availability zones. And depending on the region, there can be a different number of availability zones. For instance, in Oregon, there are 4, and in California, there's 3 AZs. And it provides redundancy and high availability in case that you want to deploy a network or extend your private network into the cloud. There's something called a virtual private cloud, which is VPC. And VPC can expand across different availability zones. However, the subnet that you create within the VPC can only be within a single AZ. There can be like 2 types of subnets. One is a private subnet, which can only talk to instances within a subnet, or if you have a VPN, you can connect out to your on-prem network. Then there's the public subnet. Again, just like private subnet, you can talk within each other, within the subnet itself. But what's different is that if you have an internet gateway, it has a public IP address, and you can reach the instances that's blowing the public subnet from the outside. Also, if you have elastic IP, you can also get from the instances that's deployed in the public subnet out to the internet to get any updates if you need to. Within a subnet, you're going to be deploying a instance. Instance is pretty much the actual host or an IP address. And there's a security group which acts like a firewall to protect the instance. So you can configure the firewall rules, and the firewall rules are stateful. There's also a concept called network ACL. Network ACL applies to the subnet as a whole. And it works in conjunction with the security group that you deploy for the actual instance. Now, to connect the private subnet that you have extended into the public cloud, you'll need to have a VPN set up. So there's a VPN gateway on the private subnet side, and then there is going to be a router or VPN device on the on-prem network that you use to create the VPN between the two. And this way, if you're deploying ISE, that means that you can have different nodes in the public cloud, as well as different nodes in the on-prem network, and you can form a deployment. And if you have network devices such as an AP, wireless controller, and switches, you can connect to the ISE instances in the VPC and use that as the radio server. Okay, so here's the next poll question. Rigo, if you can just give us the results of a previous question about which cloud vendor that you're planning to use.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the previous poll, so the number one answer, the results show that our participants plan to use AWS. That actually got the overwhelming majority. And then right next down the line, I see others plan to use the Azure Cloud, followed by GCP.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there's an interesting poll question. So what is your main concern with ISE deployment in the public cloud? So there's latency, high availability, security, complexity, and cost. And my guess on this one will be A, but let me give you a few seconds to finish. All right, so now that we have covered the basics of AWS, let's talk about the ISE design basics. So ISE has a node type, or the personas. And each of the persona has different functions. So the first persona is the policy administration node, the PAN. And this is where you log in to create the policies or manage the deployment itself. Think of it as the node with writable access to the configuration database. And then we have the monitoring and troubleshooting node, the MNT node. And this is where all the reporting from the other secondary nodes, such as PSNs, gets aggregated. And you'll see all the live events of clients connecting or the policies being managed within the network. And then we have the PSN, the policy services node, and this is where the radius authentication terminates. And also you'll be sending the TACX request to the PSN nodes. And if you have any client interfacing portals for guest access, sponsor portals, this is the node that you'll get to. And then we have the PX Grid controller. So this is where ISE can share the context of all the users that's connecting to the other systems. Now, all these personas can work in a single box. So you have one IP address, one box, and you can have all these personas running at the same time. But that means that you have limited capability in terms of how many endpoints that you can connect. But in the other extreme case, you can have all the nodes on its own. So admin is on its own IP address or box. MNT, PSN, PX Grid, they are all on their own. If you do go with the distributed deployment, where each of the node types are on its own, then that means you can go up to 2 million endpoints, assuming that you're using the 3600 appliances or equivalent. In the case if you're using a standalone ISE with all the personas, then you can go up to 50,000 concurrent endpoints. So how does it look, in terms of the actual deployments? So in a very small one for the lab and evaluation, you can go up to 100 endpoints, but in a real deployment, you probably want to have 2 nodes for redundancy. And 2 nodes with all the services running, this is the minimum that you would probably want to have on a real deployment. You can again go up to 50,000 endpoints if you're using 3600 appliances, or up to 20,000 if you're using the older appliance. Now, if you want to have pull out the PSN function from the deployment, maybe you want to have some local presence of radio server on the campus network, then you can do so, and you can have up to 6 PSNs. And you have 2 nodes that's running the admin, MNT, and maybe optionally a PX Grid node. But again, you're still confined to, as a whole deployment, up to 50,000 endpoints. Now, if you want to go extreme, then that means you can go up to 2 million endpoints. And that's where you have, again, admin on its own box, as well as MNT on its own box. And you probably want to have 2 of each for redundancy. And you can go up to 50 PSN nodes in this kind of deployment, as well as up to 4 PX grid nodes. Now, because each of the PSN node can support up to 100,000 endpoints, you don't have to have 50 PSN nodes. You can essentially have like 20 PSN nodes and cover the 2 million endpoints if you want to. But of course, with redundancy, you probably want to have more. Okay, now let's look at the supported platforms. So ISE can obviously be installed on the ISE SNS platform. And it can also be installed on the hypervisor, such as VMware, KVM, and Microsoft Hyper-V. And also, if you want to deploy it into the cloud, previously you can install the ISE on VMware Cloud upon the AWS and Azure cloud. And again, what we are introducing today is Cisco ISE on the AWS as EC2 instance. Now, for the previous ways of installation, there are the 3600 appliances and the 3500 appliances. The two things I want to mention in this slide is we are dropping support for the 3515 with the 3.1. So the 3515 has been end of life already, but with the 6 cores and 16 gigabyte of RAM, it just didn't have enough power to run the 3.1 software. So we are dropping. So if you're upgrading and you have 3515, make sure that you have a replacement hardware for that node. And on the VMware deployment, we need to make sure that if you're upgrading to 3.1, you are running VMware version 6.5 and above. Okay, so now let's talk about the ISE in the AWS EC2 instance. So before I dive into some of the detail, I want to mention that there are two instance type families that we are introducing. One is the C5 and the other one is M5. The C families are very high performance capable, whereas the M5 is more generic purpose, and it's a little bit cheaper than the C5 series. Note that if you want to run anything with the PSN persona, so PSN is the radio server, and it's the one that gets all the requests, right? So it needs a high performance. Then you need to run the C5 instance types. So again, if you're going to have PSN persona on that node, we only support C5 instances for that. However, if you're going to be running the admin, the PAN, and MNT persona, or a combination of, and then you can run the M5 instance for those node types. The other thing that I want to mention is that for the GA, so end of July, we're initially going to introduce the first 3, the C5 4x large, C5 9x large, and the M5 4x large. And then later on, we're going to introduce the rest of the 2 M5 instance types that can be used for the admin and MNT. Just to give you a little bit more detail, just know that these numbers are still in work in progress. If you're using the C5 4x large and you have all the personas, right? So the admin, MNT, the PSN, and the PX grid is running on the single box, you can have up to 10,000 endpoints on this node type. And if this instance is dedicated for PSN, that means that it can run up to 40,000 active sessions. Now, because this is dedicated for the PSN function, or if you're running all the personas in the single box, you're not going to be using this as a dedicated admin or dedicated MNT. So that's why it's set to NA. And say for similar to for the C5 9x large, you can go up to 25,000 if you have all the personas running. And if this is dedicated as PSN only, then you can go up to 100,000 sessions. And going into the admin and MNT, again, you're only going to introduce the M5 4xLars for the initial GA release. And you cannot use this node for a standalone or the PSN only function. You have to make it run as a admin or MNT, and you can go up to 500,000 global sessions. Of course, to support this, you'll need some set of C5 for XLARs or the 9XLARs as a PSN on the deployment. The other numbers are TBD, but we are trying to have parity in terms of the scalability. So currently we support up to 2 million endpoints on the on-prem. So we are trying to match that number with the EC2 instance types as well. One last note about these numbers. These numbers are a pure radius AAA traffic. So if you're using a combination of like a guest access or the posture assessment or BYOD, and then you need to account for that, which will be less number than these numbers on the PSN and the actual standalone sessions. Okay, so a quick note on the TCO. We are going to publish something more detailed towards the GA timeframe, but just know that the cost of the AWS EC2 instance is a little bit more than the on-prem VMware deployments or VM deployments. And it's much cheaper than the appliance in general. But again, I'll just leave it at this, but know that we'll have a more detailed analysis towards the GA timeframe. Okay, so talking about like licensing, is there any special licensing that you need to purchase? For now, the answer is no. You're going to purchase licensing for ISE from Cisco, and you're just going to pay for the actual infrastructure from Amazon. So for instance, if you want to deploy a ISE node, you're going to go to Cisco and buy a VM license for that instance type. And you're going to go to the AWS Marketplace, search for ISE, and then you'll be finding it out. And depending on which node type that you want to use, you're going to pick the instance type, and then you're going to pay the Amazon for the instance types, including the disk space for EBS, as well as the network traffic and the actual hardware. And then once you want the client licenses, such as the Essentials and the Premier, then you need to purchase that on top of the VM license, depending on how many clients that you'll be connecting through that ISE instance. Okay, so there's another poll question. So Rigo, do you have the results from the previous question?
Yes, absolutely. So the previous question in the third poll, the question was, what is your main concern with ISE in the public cloud? And I do see that latency was definitely the top concern from our audience. Security was also up there in the number 2 spot, and then followed by cost.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Okay, so next question is which persona do you plan to move to the cloud? So again, we support distributed deployment where you can have some nodes in the public cloud and some nodes on the on-prem network. And the question is, which node are you, or which instance site, which persona you're planning to move into the cloud first? All right. Okay, now that we have covered the basics of AWS and ISE deployment, let's talk about the ISE in the AWS setup. So in terms of the ISE setup options, and there are three main ways when you're deploying a single node or one at a time. So the first one is the AWS in the Marketplace. This is where you just search for ISE in the Marketplace, and then you just bring it up. And the next option is using the CloudFormation template. So template provides some guidance in terms of what options that you can select in terms of the EC2 instance type, and also does the input validation for some of the things that you'll be filling out. Even though the Marketplace is set up as a separate item. In fact, Marketplace uses the cloud formation template in the background. And I'll show you what it looks like and how it kind of functions together. And last option is the AMI, so Amazon Machine Image. So this is like a ISO file that you can get, and then you can just install it on your own. Just know that this is not recommended, and it's not supported for the ISE installation, because if you install it on your own, there are many things that can go wrong in terms of the ISE node host name or time zones that you may not really know which one to set up for. So I'll show you a quick demo on why we're not allowing the AMI based install and recommend using the AWS Marketplace install. So if you want to bring up multiple ISE nodes at the same time, then we have two options. You can use one of those infrastructure as a code tools, such as Ansible and Terraform. There's also other tools that's out there like Puppet and Chef, but the reason I only have these two is because we are going to provide a SDK for these two tools. And we also have Cisco MSX, Managed Services Accelerator. So this is a cloud-native multi-tenant service, and that can help you, deploy ISE instances, as well as some of the connectivity. So if you want to deploy a radius in the cloud, MSX can assist you to deploy the ISE as well as the VPN or SD-WAN, so you can have connectivity to the on-prem network for your network devices. And I explained that a little bit detail in the later slide. Now, just because you're bringing up multiple nodes doesn't mean that you have to use these tools. You can bring up multiple nodes using the marketplace. You just need to go through that multiple times, right? So if you want to bring up 6 nodes, that means that you just go through the marketplace and install of ISE nodes 6 times, and you can still do that. It's just that if you want to automate deployment, then you'll be using one of these IOC tools or MSX. So what are the prerequisites before you can actually get the ISE up and running? So first, you need to decide on which region and the AZs that you're going to be using. And then once you decide on that, create a VPC, the virtual private cloud, and the subnet within the VPC. And you're going to create a security group to control what traffic can reach the ISE instances. And you also need to decide on the instance types. So depending on whether it's a distributed deployment or a single deployment, you need to know how many clients that you're going to be supporting and decide how many you're deploying and which instance type that you're going to be using. And you're going to be setting up the VPN so that the instance can be reached from the network devices on the on-prem network, or maybe you have the ISE nodes on-prem that you want to have a distributed deployment for. And this is something special for the cloud deployment. You need to also have a key pair generated for your SSH access. So unlike the VMware on-prem or the appliance, you cannot use the username and password for your SSH. You have to use a key pair to get onto the SSH on the admin console of ISE. And as well as the on-prem deployments, you need to know the host name, the domain name, the DNS server, NTP IP address, as well as the time zone and the credentials that you want to use for GUI. Now, the lack of, hopefully you notice the lack of IP address. So in the VPC, you need to, you can only use the dynamic IP address. So IP address will be dynamically assigned by the subnet setting within the VPC. However, what that means is when you have a dynamic IP that's allocated for your instance, you need to make sure that IP address has been updated on your DNS server after it comes back online. So as it comes on, you'll notice what IP address has been assigned and make sure that's been added to your DNS server for forward and reverse lookup. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick demo and using the AMI without the cloud formation template. Okay, so this is my EC2 or AWS dashboard, and I'm on the EC2 settings. And here's the AMIs I have access to. So as you can see, there is the ISE 3.1 beta image that I have access to. And if I want to install it using the AMI method, I'm going to select it, and I'm going to launch it. And immediately, as you can see, it allows you to select any instance types. But as you know, there are only 5 instance types that we're supporting with the ISE deployments. So you need to go to the instance family and locate the ones that are supported. And we support the C5 for X large, which is the smallest box that you can get, and you need to select it. So first problem, right? I mean, you need to know which instance type that you can select and make sure that you're selecting the right one. Next is the configuration. So this is very similar to the CloudFormation template, but there are a lot more options that you actually need. So, it can be confusing. And the other thing is the inputs for domain name, the host name, the admin password, those are using the user data. And let me show you what it actually looks like if you were to do it manually. So you have these, host name, the DNS server IP address, and the DNS and the time zones. And these are if you make a mistake in these, attributes, like password doesn't conform to the requirements, such as it doesn't have the special characters, or the time zone doesn't exist, then you will have a failed install. So this is some of the reasons that we don't want you to use the AMI method for the installation. And next is the storage. So the minimum size is 300 gigabytes. But this form doesn't allow you to control that. So if your user enters in smaller value, it will just bring it up, and it will fail because you don't have the right amount of space. So these are main reasons that we are not going to allow the AMI-based install for ISE. Okay, let me go back to the slide deck real quick. So what is the CloudFormation template that we are speaking about? So CloudFormation template looks like this. You can see it in the JSON format or YAML format, but it provides an easy way to bring up a stack. Stack is a collection of the disk space or the instance type, and even the networking components. It also provides the input validation. So when you're entering in the like host name, you make sure that the host name characters conforms to the requirements. And also make sure that all the options for instance types are listed, so that you don't have to search for them or select a wrong instance type that's not supported. So again, even though if you're using Marketplace, CloudFormation template is being used in the background, and I'll show you what it looks like. So in the GA, once you release, how do you actually get the ISE instance running? So first of all, you still need to complete the prerequisites, right? So creating the SSH key, creating the VPC and the subnet has to be done beforehand. And once those are done, you can just go ahead and search ISE in the AWS Marketplace. And then you're going to select a region that you want to deploy ISE into. And it will ask all the VPC and the subnet that's related to that region for you that you are going to place ISE in for. And then once you have that, you're going to fill in the stack information, such as host name, DNS, domain name, and so forth. And then once you're done, you're going to launch the instance. Okay, so let's do a quick demo on the Marketplace plus the CloudFormation template. Now, because ISE 3.1 is not released yet, it's not searchable in the Marketplace. So for the first few parts, I'm going to show you in a slide form, and then I'll jump into the actual deployment and show you the CloudFormation template where it merges with the Marketplace installation. So what you're going to do is go to the Marketplace and just search for ISE. And once you search for ISE, you're going to click on it, and you'll be greeted with the overview page of the ISE deployment. And here you can look at some of the licensing info and the release notes. And you can launch it, and you can just go through the terms and conditions, and you can go on to the continue to configuration. And once you go there, it's going to have a list of regions that it's supported for. Again, this was a mock-up, so it only has like 5 or 6 regions. But in the deployment, once it hits the GA, it's going to have all the regions that's available to you. Once you select a region, you can click on launch. And at this point, it's actually going to be launching the CloudFormation and template in the background. And you'll notice this icon that shows that it's updating. And at this point, let me switch back to the AWS console and show you what it looks like. So you have to go to the CloudFormation. Again, you don't have to do this, but I'm just showing you where it kind of merges between the marketplace and the CloudFormation template. And I'm going to create a stack. And again, you don't have to do this, but I'm just going to upload a template file on my own. And this is where the marketplace screen will land on. After that, like refresh icon that we were seeing. And once you click on next, you'll see this form where it shows the stack name that you want to install for. And I have pre-filled this information using my template, but you'll have a host name, you'll have the key pair for SSH, and you can select the network that you, or the security group that you're going to use for the firewall function. And you're also going to select the management network where you're going to place ISE for. In this case, I have a subnet called ISE, and this is where I'm going to place the ISE node. And the time zone, again, is already pre-filled, but you can select a different time zone if you want to for your deployment. And again, there's the 5 supported instance types that you can select from. And you can select the volume size all the way from 300 gigabytes all the way to 2.4 terabytes. And AMI ID for the region is already pre-selected. And the rest of the information is already something that you know, right? Domain name, the DNS server IP address, and NTP, as well as the password. And once you click next, you can add tags if you want to look at it later using the API. And you can just click on next and review. And at this point, you can just create a stack and it will bring up the instance for your network. So as you can see, it's creating the stack right now, and that means it's going to bring up the instance type as well as the volume that you have assigned for into that subnet that you have assigned. So this is, ISE instance will take about 20 to 25 minutes to get all the way up and running. But I have another instance type that's already in progress, and I brought up earlier. And you can see that some details about the instance. You can go to resources and look at the actual instance. And here you'll be able to see the actual IP address that's been assigned to the instance. And in this case, I'm using a public subnet. So that's why I have public IP address as well as the internal IP address on this instance. If you want to get to it, again, you can get this IP. I have already added to DNS, so that's why I have the ISE 2 in there. But if you want to get to it, you get the same page for the admin console. And if you want to get access to the instance using the SSH, then you can do so by just SSH, and then have a option I, and then the actual key file that you have downloaded, and then use the admin username and to the IP address, and you should be able to get to the instance using SSH. Again, you cannot use the username and password anymore. Okay. So now that we have done that, so that was the way that you can install the single instance. But again, if you want multiple instances, and then you can obviously run it multiple times and have multiple instances up and running. Now, what if you want to have multiple instances and automate the deployment? So again, you can use the infrastructure as a code tools such as Ansible or Terraform. And we are providing the Ansible SDK, and it's already available to you if you go to this link. And in the near future, we're also going to give you the SDK for Terraform as well. So you have two ways to install the multiple ISE instances in the cloud. So we briefly talked about the Cisco MSX. So what is Cisco MSX? So MSX is a service creation and delivery platform, and it allows the enterprise and the service providers to create pay-as-you-go model service, and using it reduces deployment time from like a few weeks, even months, to just a few days. This is a cloud-native multi-tenant service, and it not only enables the ISE up and running in the cloud, but also allows you to chain all the service to provide connectivity between on-prem network and all the way to the ISE, so that your network devices can use the ISE in the cloud as a radio service. So what does Cisco ISE with the MSX look like? So as a customer, you can focus on what is important to you, which is policy creation, management, and the day-end operations, such as viewing live events. However, any of the daily operations of the underlying services, such as patching, the installation of ISE, as well as the upgrades, these are all managed by the service provider. And also the connectivity between the on-prem network to the cloud can be orchestrated by using the MSX. And in many cases, some of these services, such as like guest access, you can even have a service provision for you without you having to even log on to the ISE GUI. So for more information about MSX and deploying ISE with the MSX, you can just go to this link. And with that, let me jump into the last section of the slide today, which is caveats around deploying ISE in the public cloud. Before I dive in, Rigo, do you have the results from the last poll question?
Yes, we do. So for our final poll, we wanted to know which persona do you plan to move to the cloud? And we have a good mix of answers, with the high majority saying that they plan to move everything. And then in close second, we have those who would use PSN, and then PAN and MNT.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Okay, so what are some of the caveats? Just know that we try to make feature parity between the cloud deployment and the on-prem deployment, all the way from the scalability and the features. However, there are some differences because of the nature of the deployment types, right? The first is the interfaces. Just like the VM deployment, I mean, you cannot use like NIC bonding, where you can bond multiple interfaces, and that's something that you cannot do within the AWS deployment. And you wouldn't probably do that anyways. The next one is the IP address and the DNS. So again, because the subnet within the AWS uses dynamic IP address allocation, that means anytime you bring up an instance, that you need to make sure that that dynamic IP has been updated on your DNS server, so your client and your network devices can find it. The internet access, two questions about it, right? Can I access ISE from the internet? Or what kind of internet access does the ISE need when they're deployed in the cloud? And I'll talk about that in next section. Latency, it doesn't change. 300 millisecond is what you want amongst all the ISE instances. So if you have on-prem deployment and the cloud deployment, make sure that between the two, the latency is within the 300 milliseconds. So that's identical to what we have what we require for the on-prem deployments. The next one is MTU. Yes, we do support the Jumbo frame, and it is enabled by default, at least for now, in the AWS deployments. And we also have Path MTU along with it. So you shouldn't see any issues in terms of the MTU on your network. The next one is IPv6. As it stands right now, the AWS, the VPN gateway doesn't support v6. So that's why we can't support v6. That means you can use v6 within the subnet or VPC. But if you're trying to get out to the on-prem network, you cannot use v6. That means your network device will not be able to talk using v6 to your ISE instances in the cloud. I'll talk about load balancing in the later slide in more detail. And then there's the upgrade and patching. We are going to allow patching in the cloud deployments. However, upgrade will be limited, meaning if you want to upgrade from 3.1 to, say, 3.2 in the future, you'll have to do a backup and then restore into a new instance that you bring up with the 3.2. So what that means is that you have set up 3.1 ISE instances. And if you want to go to 3.2, you need to bring up new ISE instances that's running 3.2. You want to back up the 3.1 config and then restore it into 3.2. And then you can change the DNS and IP DNS in general so that our new instances are up and running and you can terminate the old instances. And we'll have a more description on how that works with some details. The volume encryption is something that we're testing right now. And because of encryption, you'll have a less scalability on a given node. We don't have the exact number on this, but we are trying to provide it, support it. But at the same time, just know that if we do support it, it's going to be a less number of sessions per box if you're using the encryption on the instances. Console access is supported on certain regions within AWS. However, because the console requires the SSH key, you will not be able to log in, at least for now. That means that you can see all the live events on the console. You can see that. However, you will not be able to log in using console access, at least for now. Okay, so let me just briefly talk about the ISE and Internet Access. So ISE requires Internet access. First, there's the admin persona. So to get the feed update, the posture update, and getting the telemetry as well as the smart licensing, admin node requires Internet access. So whether you provide Internet access by placing ISE in the public subnet, but make sure that you're protecting it using the security group, or using some proxy, or even making the internet traffic go through your on-prem network, that's fine. But ISE will require Internet access. And if you think that, oh, is it just admin node? No, that's not the case. If you have PSN node is the one that's actually performing the authentication of the clients. And that means whenever the ISE needs, to authenticate a user that's based on the cloud, such as like a MDM or EMM lookup, then that PSN node itself will need Internet access. Now, on the flip side, how about the question of, oh, now that we can deploy ISE in the cloud, does that mean we can reach ISE from the internet for ISE admin function or any of the client portal for like sponsorship or API? Technically, yes, but just know that ISE in itself wasn't designed for a cloud native application, right? So it was an enterprise application that's supposed to be on the campus network. So although this is technically possible, it is not supported and not recommended. Okay, and let's talk about the load balancers. If you can deploy like F5 load balancer in the cloud, and it's fully supported with ISE. But if you want to leverage the AWS load balancer options, there are two load balancers that is supported. One is the application load balancer, which is for the web traffic. And the other one is the network load balancer for radius or other traffic. This will be supported on the static pages, such as the sponsor portals, the client provisioning portals, and those can be used with the application load balancer because it's just simply a web server, right? However, if you want to load balance radius or like the redirected flow for CWA, guest access, or BYOD, then you can use the network load balancer. There are two caveats around using the network load balancer. One is the sticky, right? So you have, if you're using some of the advanced load balancers, such as F5, you can sticky based on session or the MAC address. But you cannot do that because you can't sticky based on those radius traffic. That means you have to stick it based on the source IP, which is a network device. So you have to stick a whole network device, such as a wireless controller, to the same PSN node. So just know that as a limitation. And two is the keep alive. How do you actually check for the radius service up and running? And currently, it's not that easy, right? You can just do a ping to the PSN node and assume that it kind of follows the services, but that's not always the case. The ISE node may be up and running, but radius service may be down. So the keep alive and checking for the radius service is not something that you can do with the network load balancer. So just know that caveat if you're going to be using any of the AWS native load balancers. Okay, so with that, I'm going to give you some links for additional resources. Again, because it's not a released product yet, if you go to the ISE pages, you're not going to see anything around the AWS. However, as we close to the GA, this page will be updated, and you'll see information about the deployment guide, as well as the best practices and the TCO. There are also information about the SDK. You can just go there and get the SDK for Ansible. Now you can't do anything with it. However, you can look at the code and see if it helps for your future ISE deployment in the cloud. And there is the information about the MSX if you want to deploy ISE using the MSX. And for future webinars, again, next month, Thomas Howard will be going through the API. And in August, I'll go through all the things about ISE 3.1 as well. So you can just go to this link and get sign up for the future webinars. And with that, let me open up for any questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Hasuk. All right, so we have a few minutes left, and we're going to dive into some live Q&A before we wrap up. And let's see, we just have a few questions here to address for our audience. And the first one here is it possible to deploy ISE in AWS and import configuration backup from ISE 3.0?
Yes, you can certainly do that. When you do that, only caveat is make sure that you're only uploading the application config and not the underlying configuration that does like IP addressing. But yes, that is certainly possible.
Perfect, thank you. Next question here is, why don't the CloudFormation template add a static IP to the EC2 instances? The first static elastic IP is and easy to add even after setup.
Yes, good question. We don't really support if you're using it for the outbound access, and then you can certainly do that. It's just that for the initial release, we're not allowing any modification to the CloudFormation template. In general, we're expecting many customers not use the elastic IP and just use the private subnet and just extend your private, on-prem network into the cloud. But if you think it's something that you really need, let us know, and then we'll definitely consider it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hasuk. And final question here before we wrap up. Can I run an ELB in front of ISE policy nodes?
ELB. I think I covered the four load balancer types. One was the ALB and the other one was NLB. Personally, I'm not familiar with the ELB, so I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, no worries at all. Thank you so much for addressing that, Hasuk, for our audience. So with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up our webinar for today. And I would just like to give you a very big thanks, Hasuk, for speaking about ISE and AWS with our audience. I hope that everyone found great value in the information and resources that were shared here today. I would also like to extend a very big thank you to each and every one of our panelists for lending a hand with all of the questions throughout the webinar. We really appreciate it. And just a quick reminder for our audience that you will receive a short pop-up survey as soon as you exit the webinar. And we would be so grateful if you can just take a few minutes to complete it and let us know how you like today's presentation. We always look forward to receiving your valuable feedback. And again, for those of you who are interested in revisiting this session, we will have the recording available for on-demand viewing within about 5 business days after today. For your reference, I posted the link to our ICE training videos page in the chat window. That's where the recording will be located once it has been published. So we highly encourage you to save the link and bookmark it and refer to it within a couple of days for that recording. But you will also be receiving a follow-up email within about 15 minutes or so that will contain that very same link. So please do keep an eye on your email inbox for that. And then lastly, as Hasuk also mentioned a little while ago, there is another webinar coming up early next month on July 6th, as you can see on the screen here, and that's going to be covering ISE 3.0, APIs, Ansible, and automation with our speaker and presenter, Thomas Howard. So if you haven't done so already, we do highly encourage you to join us for that session and register for the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and repost the link to where you can register in the chat window for your reference. So again, we do invite you to join us for that session as well. Thanks again to our presenter, to our panelists, and to all of our attendees for joining us here live. I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.